greater levels of subdivision without having to amalgamate or to protect any vegetation. They just wanted more subdivision potential. Some specified new minimum areas that they thought were appropriate, and some wanted the vegetation protection provisions to allow for subdivision on the same site, whereas in the notified plan, if you were protecting some bush and adding to it, you couldn't subdivide on that property. It just let you subdivide in another area, a countryside living area or a mixed rural area. You couldn't do it in situ. So we had some strong submissions saying, why can't I protect this vegetation and create 2, 3, 4, or 5 or 10 titles on a large rural property? We have interim guidance from the panel on rural subdivision. So the panel thought that felt that the provisions were too restrictive and that there should be more provision in rural areas. Not too specific in terms of that interim guidance, just a bit of a signal that they felt that the approach that I've just discussed was too restrictive. They made mention of subdivision providing resilience to the effects of natural hazards. They talked about the productive potential of elite land should not be undermined, but I think that was obviously quite clearly a focus on elite, but not the second class, which is prime land. Right. So we got that quite strongly from the panel that elite land was important, but not necessarily prime land, and that rural subdivision should enable the protection, rehabilitation or enhancement of significant Indigenous biodiversity, which, as I mentioned before, we had some controls in there that did that, but they perhaps were signalling that we should have a different regime or a more incentive for protecting Indigenous biodiversity. The guidance went on in terms of talking about where rural lifestyle subdivision should be enabled and the constraints that should apply in terms of location, the scale and the density. They talked about the avoiding elite land. They talked about not impacting on mineral extraction, so quarries. You should sort of be careful in terms of allowing for subdivision around a quarry. They talked about the importance of landscapes and rural character. That needs to be factored in where subdivision might be allowed. They talked about protecting ecological areas, landscapes, avoiding reverse sensitivity effects that might hinder the rural economy, and safeguarding infrastructure. So that was the guidance from the panel after the regional policy statement. So Council's position at the hearings on the rural provisions and these 5 rural zones. In terms of rural activities, really just some refinements to the activity rules, changing some of the definitions to make them clearer, but there were some provisions endorsed by the Council and taken into the hearings to provide for a subsidiary dwelling or dwelling on a rural property with some very strict controls around that subsidiary dwelling. Also more allowance for workers' accommodation, post-harvest facilities and outdoor rural tourist and visitor activities. So we did support some more flexibility for those activities, but overall largely retained the approach. Infrastructure, again, strong submissions and evidence from the network utility companies that we had a too restrictive approach on infrastructure, so there were some changes supported there at the hearings by the Council. But Council continued to provide evidence in support of protecting elite and prime land, not just elite land, because of its productive potential and benefit to the economy. Council's position in terms of subdivision, a lot of detail here, but so it really goes through each of the 5 zones. So the rural production zone, the main zone, we had 150 hectare minimum in the notified plan. That was proposed to be reduced to 80 hectares with an average of 100. The mixed rural zone, the proposal was to reduce it from 150 to 40 hectares with an average of 50. The rural coastal zone, a new 40 hectare and a new average of 50. Previously, as I mentioned, general subdivision was simply not allowed in the rural coastal zone. Rural conservation, the new site size was proposed to be 10 hectares and an average of 20. Again, there was no provision for general subdivision in the rural conservation zone. The Council did propose limited provision for that in situ or within the site subdivision where biodiversity is being protected and enhanced on that particular site, so it didn't have to be a subdivision right that would transfer to another place. The general transfer by amalgamation was retained, but all transfers are now proposed to go into the countryside living zone. Previously, they were allowed to go into other parts of rural Auckland, and there was some evidence that that's not a good approach. It's sort of shifting the problem from one area to another. So now it's a very strong focus on the countryside living areas where if there's any amalgamation, then the new benefit should go to a countryside living area and not just shift to another part of the general rural area. And in the countryside living zone, the minimum site size is typically 2 hectares without a transfer. But if you're amalgamating and transferring into the countryside living area, then in most cases it goes down to 1 hectare. But that's not always the case. That's just the probably most common approach. All the different countryside living areas are carefully mapped with their own special subdivision controls. The prohibited activity status, i.e. you can't subdivide at all, was used much more sparingly in terms of council's evidence at the hearings to really target transferable rural site subdivision to the appropriate receiver locations, for example, countryside living areas, and away from elite and prime soils. To avoid separating a subsidiary dwelling from the main dwelling, that would be prohibited if someone attempted to subdivide that off. And to avoid what we call double clipping of the rules, i.e. subdividing land by protecting an SEA and also using the general subdivision rules. So there was some prohibited status retained, but the very bold approach in the notified plan of widespread prohibited subdivision, we really didn't have the evidence to support that, but certainly didn't go as far as some submitters were asking for in terms of subdivision. So in this one we did very much pick up on the signals from the panel, listened very carefully to submitters, put a package of subdivision forward, and others have argued for a more permissive approach, and probably some argued for the status quo or a more restrictive approach. So as I mentioned, a very, quite a complicated topic, rural Auckland, but that's the reference to where the evidence sits on the hearing panel website, council's evidence and the evidence from a wide range of rural landowners, the farming community, horticulture community, federated farmers and so on, quarries, all have their evidence sitting in those topics.
Well done, John. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I want to talk about the effect or what came up in the submissions around the Waitakere Ranges Heritage Area Foothills area, because I know people submitted on that. And kind of you got these rules, but there's that piece of legislation, and in some of this the panel's interim guidance, did that kind of speak to any of that?
Yeah, thank you.
Because I mean, some of that is not elite land. It's not even prime land. It's old horticultural land that's basically not productive anymore, but it's not of a significant ecological value anywhere. So is that made that kind of silent because it's such a tricky area?
No, well, that really ran its own process because the Waitakere Ranges has a series of precincts on it.
Yes.
And the focus of our attention, it was not from me looking at rural areas. We just had a general zone there, but quite specifically the precinct overrode many, if not most, of the rules in that zone and really created its own code,
Place to do nothing.
like, for that. And I wasn't involved in those hearings. That was really a topic on its own with its own people.
So there's no guidance about that at the moment?
No, that really would have come up under a different topic.
So even though it's rural, it wouldn't have come up under rural? Okay.
Because of that overlay precinct. And yes, we're aware, of course, that it has its own Act of Parliament and so on. And that does have a very direct bearing on the main zones there.
Please transfer.
But in fact, the privately owned land, especially in the foothills, all has precincts on it, which are very, very specific. And I think the intention was that they carry forward the Waitakere operative plan provisions.
Okay, and so will that come up in, is there any opportunity for when we actually get this stuff to tease out a little bit of that? Because there's a lot of submitters and a lot of pretty sad elderly people around
But
that
John,
issue.
when are
So
we
will
likely
that
to
come
see
up
that?
when
So
we?
it's a process question, really. So receiving the panel's recommendations in a month, 22nd of July, 27th of July, we will provide you with a briefing on the key policy shifts that we've identified from the panel and just assist you to find the relevant parts of the panel's recommendations. And then in early August, I think it's around about the 3rd or 4th of August, you'll be able to book a session with a
Great.
planner to ask them specific questions about the Waitakere Ranges or any other topic.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just around the elite soils, just want to get some clarification. I'm assuming that there was evidence, and we're following through on elite being not just the soil itself, but also temperature related. So what's special about Pukekohe is not just the soil, but also the frost-free aspect. So we've got that.
Absolutely. We had an approach in the plan, as many of you I'm sure will know, of really looking after not only elite land, which is technically class 1, but elite and prime land, and really our soil scientists were pivotal in helping us put that approach together. And I guess a quick rule of thumb is that there's not a lot of difference, in fact, in terms of productivity between the three land classes. It's just the inputs. You need almost no inputs into class 1. You might need to do a little bit of drainage on class 2, and it's up to the productivity of class 1. It's that kind of thing. As a parcel, we felt
I understand
it was
that.
worth
I mean,
looking after all three.
the point that was made by the vegetable growers down there is because you've got the good soils and you've got the frost-free, they can bring their potatoes forwards, and that's pretty unique.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
that's okay.
that really underpinned, and their evidence, they gave very good submissions at the actual hearing, and support of that approach, and in fact in support of council.
Okay, and the other question I've got that just goes to subdivision and this downsizing around the minimum sizes, you know, down to 80, down to 40 and the like. I haven't read the evidence, but I'm assuming that the council's got an evidence base around that.
Yes, apparently.
Councillor, yes, to answer the question, there was an evidential base to sorting out those minimum averages and also the minimums. There was a sort of a trawl through the data on lot sizes and trying to find a position at the upper end of the scale so that, you know, from council's point of view, it was starting from a position where it really didn't want to facilitate a lot of urban development in a rural context. So it was really a case about trying to maximise size.
That's right.
Yep.
Thank you. And just clarification again, the interim guidance came back recommending avoidance of the loss of the elite soils. Are elite category 1 and then prime are 2 and 3?
Correct.
Okay, so they only talked about that first category.
Yes, they did, and that's actually a very limited area within the region.
Yeah.
In fact, just west of Pukekohe.
Okay, and our subsequent evidence was to hold the course on the first 3 categories?
All 3.
Okay, thank you. Any, Councillor Cashmore?
Just the 2 questions. Good to see you guys. The reverse sensitivity issues, was that across all classes
Yes.
of rural production? So there's
Yes. You'll see if you look at the final track change version for the regional policy that we're also looking at the productive importance of the lesser quality land. And that really comes from, largely from submissions by industries like the poultry industry and the pig industry and so on, where you don't really want them on elite and prime land, but you do want them in rural areas, and you want a place for them to go without the reverse sensitivity effects that you would get if you allowed pepper potting of subdivision. Mushrooms, I must say, is another example. So it's those kinds of industries which should be in a rural area, but not on the highest quality soils.
my second question, Mr. Chairman, is to do with SEAs, ecological blocks. Those. Just we need some clarification here, so it's, because Penny Webb's not here, I'm asking this really on behalf of her. Allowing a bit of in situ, potentially, in situ subdivision or for protection of biodiversity or additional planting to an SEA block. Is there any transferable titles provisions being requested from existing SEA areas?